The first thing my mother said wasn't hello, it was, "You'll be home for Christmas this year. I already told everyone." I was standing in a courthouse hallway in Santa Clara, my phone pressed between my shoulder and ear, a thin folder tucked under my arm. Inside it was a finalized settlement agreement with my name on it. My signature was still fresh, the ink barely dry. I had just regained control of something that had been taken from me quietly, strategically, and with full confidence that I would never fight back. But my mother didn't know that yet. "I'm in the middle of something," I said, watching a bailiff walk past with a stack of files. "Can we talk later?" There was a pause on the line. Not silence. Calculation. "You're always in the middle of something," she replied. "That's been your problem since you moved away. You forget where you come from." I didn't argue. I hadn't argued in years. I learned early that arguing gave them energy. Silence made them uncomfortable. "I'll think about it," I said. "No," she corrected me. "You'll come. Your sister is hosting Christmas Eve this year. It's important you're there. People will notice if you're not." There it was. Not want, not miss. Notice. "I'll call you back," I said, and hung up before she could say my name, the way she used to when she wanted obedience disguised as affection. I leaned against the wall and closed my eyes for a moment. My reflection stared back at me from the glass of a framed court notice. 32 years old. Dark circles I pretended were just shadows from bad lighting. A navy blazer I'd bought on clearance because it photographed well for meetings. Someone who looked composed enough that no one would guess how often she'd been treated like an accessory in her own family. My name is Evelyn Carter, and until 3 months ago, everything I thought I owned had already been promised to someone else. I grew up in a quiet suburb outside Sacramento, the kind of neighborhood with trimmed hedges, block parties, and a shared understanding of who mattered. In our family, that person was always my younger sister, Lila. Lila was 3 years younger, louder, prettier in the effortless way that made people forgive her before she asked. She had a talent for filling rooms without doing much at all. I was the opposite, observant, careful, the one who remembered details, paid bills on time, stayed late to clean up after Thanksgiving dinner, while everyone else watched football. My parents used to say, "You're the responsible one, Evie. We never worry about you." It took me years to understand that wasn't a compliment. It was permission to neglect me. When our grandmother Ruth passed away, I was 29 and working as an operations manager for a mid-sized logistics company in San Jose. I'd flown home for the funeral, sat in the second pew, held my mother's hand while she cried into a tissue she never quite unfolded. Grandma Ruth had been the only person in our family who asked real questions. Not, "How's work?" but, "Are they paying you what you're worth?" Not, "Are you seeing anyone?" but, "Are you happy living the life you chose?" She owned the old family house on Maple Ridge Road, a sprawling, creaky place with a wraparound porch, rose bushes she refused to let anyone trim, and a study lined with law books from my grandfather's time. She'd told me more than once, "That house will go to someone who respects it." I thought I knew what that meant. The will was read 2 weeks later, in a small office downtown. My parents sat together on one side of the table. Lila sat next to them, scrolling through her phone, like she was waiting for a table at a restaurant. I sat alone. The attorney cleared his throat and read, "The house went to Lila. The investment accounts went to my parents. I received a small personal bequest, Grandma Ruth's watch, and a letter." That was it. No explanation. No acknowledgement of the nights I spent driving her to appointments. The weekends I'd flown in just to fix things around the house. The long phone calls where she'd talked, and I'd listened. I didn't cry. I didn't ask questions. I smiled, thanked the attorney, and left. In the parking lot, my mother hugged me too tightly and whispered, "You understand, right? Lila needs the house. She's starting a family." I nodded, because that's what I always did. 3 months later, I learned the truth, by accident. A title company called me while I was at work, asking to confirm my availability for a document correction related to the Maple Ridge property. The woman on the phone sounded confused when I told her the house wasn't mine. "Oh," she said slowly. "According to our records, you were originally listed as the primary beneficiary. The change was filed 8 weeks before your grandmother passed." 8 weeks. I remember hanging up the phone and sitting very still at my desk. The office around me buzzed with normal life. Keyboards, laughter, a coffee machine grinding beans. Someone had changed the will, legally, quietly, and no one thought I'd ever look. That night, I pulled the letter Grandma Ruth had left me out of my drawer. I'd read it once and then tucked it away because it hurt too much. This time, I read it like evidence. The last line stopped my breath. Evelyn, if anything ever feels wrong, promise me you won't stay quiet just to keep the peace. I realized something then that would change everything. I hadn't been excluded by accident. I had been managed, and the people who raised me were counting on my silence to keep their version of the story intact. My phone buzzed again. A text from my sister. Christmas Eve, 6 p.m. Don't be late. Also, Mom said wear something nice. We're taking family photos. I stared at the screen and felt something unfamiliar settle into place. Not anger, clarity. They thought Christmas was about tradition. For me, it was about timing, and I had just learned exactly when to stop being quiet. People like my parents don't wake up one day and decide to betray a child. They do it slowly, in pieces, wrapped in reason and repetition, until it feels normal, until the child learns that resistance costs more than silence. I learned early that I was the easy one. Lila cried, slammed doors, demanded explanations. I listened. I adjusted. I made myself smaller so there would be less friction in the house. My parents praised that. They called it maturity. What it really meant was compliance. After the call from the title company, I didn't confront anyone right away. Not my parents, not Lila. I didn't storm into the family group chat or demand answers. That wasn't my style, and more importantly, it wasn't useful. I started doing something I'd never done before. I paid attention. I pulled copies of public records during my lunch breaks, property filings, amendments, dates, names. Every document told the same quiet story. An original will drafted 5 years earlier, listing me as the beneficiary of the Maple Ridge house, followed by a revised version filed 8 weeks before Grandma Ruth died. The new will, named Lila. The witness signatures were different. One of them belonged to my father's longtime accountant, a man I'd met exactly twice at Christmas dinners. The other belonged to a paralegal who worked for a firm my mother had consulted in the past. Everything about it was legal. Everything about it was wrong. I still remember the first night I sat at my kitchen table in San Jose, papers spread out, my laptop glowing in the dark. I wasn't crying. I wasn't shaking. I felt strangely calm, like my body had finally stopped trying to protect me from a truth I was ready to see. They hadn't forgotten me. They had made a choice. A week later, my mother called again. "Did you get Lila's message?" she asked, as if we hadn't spoken just days earlier. "Yes." "Well, you haven't said anything. I told you I'd think about Christmas." Another pause. This one sharper. "You know," she said, "your father and I have always tried to be fair. But fairness doesn't always mean equal." I almost laughed. Almost. "That's an interesting thing to say," I replied. She ignored that. "Lila has more needs. You're independent. You always have been." There it was again. The word they used like a shield. Independent. As if independence was something I'd chosen, not something I'd been pushed into. "I'm at work," I said. "I'll call you later." She sighed, dramatic and wounded. "I just don't want this to turn into something ugly." I ended the call without responding. That night, I called an estate litigation attorney. Her name was Marjorie Klein. She sounded exactly like someone who had seen this story play out 100 times before and didn't waste time pretending otherwise. "Tell me everything," she said. So I did. I told her about Grandma Ruth, the house, the revised will, the witnesses, the timing, my parents, my sister. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "You're not crazy, and you're not imagining intent. This is what we call undue influence." I closed my eyes. Undue influence. A clean phrase for something deeply personal. "Do I have a case?" I asked. "You have a path," she replied. "Not a guaranteed outcome, but a path. And it won't be quiet." I thought of Christmas Eve, of Lila's house, of family photos in front of a tree that used to stand in Grandma Ruth's living room. "I'm not afraid of noise," I said. Over the next few weeks, my life split into 2 parallel tracks. On the surface, I was the same Evelyn everyone expected. I went to work, I answered emails, I responded politely in the family group chat with neutral messages like, "Sounds nice," and "I'll let you know." Underneath, I was assembling something, piece by piece. Marjorie requested medical records, notes from Grandma Ruth's last year, emails between my parents and the attorney who filed the revised will, financial transfers I'd never known about. The deeper we went, the clearer the pattern became. My grandmother's health had declined quickly in the final months. She'd been isolated more. My parents had started helping with her finances. The original attorney who drafted the first will had not been consulted for the revision. Someone had moved fast. Someone had counted on my nature, on my silence, on my tendency to step aside. Meanwhile, Lila sent photos. New furniture in the Maple Ridge house, a remodeled kitchen, Christmas decorations already up in November. She captioned one photo, "Finally making this place ours." Ours. I stared at the screen longer than I should have. It wasn't jealousy I felt. It was displacement. That house had been my one constant. The place I went when I needed quiet. When Grandma Ruth would hand me tea and say, "Sit, you look like someone who carries too much." And now it was being reshaped by someone who had never once asked what it meant. 2 days before Thanksgiving, my father called. "We need to talk," he said. There was an edge in his voice I recognized. He already knew something was shifting. "About what?" I asked. "About your tone lately. Your distance. Your mother feels like you're pulling away." I smiled to myself. "I am." A pause. Then, carefully, "You're not upset about the will, are you?" There it was. The question framed as concern. "No," I said calmly. "I'm informed." His breath caught just slightly. Not enough for someone else to notice. Enough for me. "Evelyn," he said, switching to the voice he used when he wanted control back. "Families don't solve things by involving outsiders." "I agree," I replied. "But families also don't rewrite history and expect silence in return." The line went quiet. When he spoke again, his voice was colder. "You're overthinking this." "No," I said. "I'm finally thinking clearly." He hung up on me. That night, I signed the paperwork to formally contest the will, not out of anger, out of alignment. I wasn't trying to punish anyone. I was reclaiming my place in a story that had been edited without my consent. Thanksgiving came and went without me. Christmas plans continued without confirmation. And somewhere between court filings and unanswered texts, I realized something important. They still thought this was a misunderstanding. They still believed I'd back down once things got uncomfortable. They had no idea I'd already decided to go all the way. And Christmas Eve was going to make that impossible to ignore. The first legal notice was delivered on a Tuesday morning. Not to my parents. Not to Lila. To the Maple Ridge house. I didn't tell anyone I'd done it. I didn't warn them. I let the process speak in my place. Marjorie had explained it to me in a flat, professional tone. Once the contest is filed, the property becomes legally frozen. No sale, no refinance. Any major modifications require disclosure. "What about renovations?" I asked. She paused. "If they continue after notice, it strengthens your case." So when Lila sent another photo 3 days later, this time of the backyard torn up for a new patio, I saved it. I didn't respond. The phone started ringing that evening. First my mother. I let it go to voicemail. Then my father. Twice. Then Lila. I finally answered on the fourth call. "What did you do?" she demanded, skipping hello. "I filed paperwork," I said. "The same way you did." "What are you talking about?" Her voice wavered between confusion and accusation. "The contractor just called and said everything is on hold. There's a legal flag on the property." "Yes." "You can't do that," she said. "This is my house. That's what we're determining." Her breath hitched. "Mom and Dad said you were just being dramatic, that you'd calm down." I closed my eyes. There it was. The assumption, spoken out loud. "I'm not dramatic," I said. "I'm precise." She lowered her voice. "You're ruining everything right before Christmas." "I'm correcting something that should never have happened." There was a long silence. When she spoke again, her tone changed. Softer, careful. "Evie," she said, using the nickname she only used when she wanted something. "Let's talk about this as sisters." I tried that for years. She exhaled sharply. "You don't understand how much pressure I'm under. The house, the family. Everyone expects this to be perfect. I almost told her the truth then, that perfection had always been built on my absence. But I didn't. I didn't need to explain. This isn't personal, I said. It's legal. She hung up. That night, my parents showed up at my apartment unannounced. I knew it was them the moment I heard the knock. Too firm to be a neighbor. Too familiar to be a stranger. I didn't open the door right away. I stood in my kitchen, listening to my mother's muffled voice through the wood. My name, over and over. Like if she said it enough times, I'd revert back to the version of me she understood. When I finally opened the door, my father stepped forward immediately, as if he expected me to retreat. "What is going on?" he demanded. I didn't invite them in. I leaned against the doorframe instead. "What's going on," I said calmly, "is that a will was changed under questionable circumstances, and I'm exercising my right to review it." My mother shook her head, already crying. "This is tearing the family apart." "No," I replied. "This is exposing it." My father's jaw tightened. "Your grandmother made her choice." "She made an original choice," I said. "And then she got sick." That landed. His eyes flicked away for half a second. "Long enough." "You're implying something very serious," he said. "I'm stating facts," I replied. "The court will decide what they imply." My mother reached for my arm. I stepped back. "Please," she said. "We can talk this through. There's no need to embarrass everyone." "There it is," I said quietly. "That's the part you care about." She froze. Behind them, the hallway was silent, doors closed, neighbors unaware of the moment everything shifted. "This isn't about embarrassment," my father snapped. "It's about respect." "Respect goes both ways," I said, "and it doesn't survive secrecy." He leaned closer, lowering his voice. "You think a judge is going to believe you over your own parents?" "I think a judge believes documents," I replied, "and timelines, and patterns." He stared at me like he was seeing a stranger. Maybe I was. They left without another word. I locked the door and slid down against it, my heart racing for the first time since this started. Not fear. Adrenaline. The kind that comes when you finally stop playing defense. The next morning, Marjorie called. "They retained counsel," she said. "Your parents." "Of course they did. They're arguing your grandmother was fully competent and acted independently." "And the witnesses?" She paused. "We're requesting depositions." That was the moment I understood what I was really walking into. This wasn't just about a house anymore. It was about forcing the people who raised me to answer questions they'd never expected to hear out loud. Under oath. Christmas Eve arrived quietly. I didn't go home. I stayed in San Jose, wrapped in a blanket on my couch, watching the city lights flicker through the window. My phone buzzed with photos from the group chat. Lila in a red dress. My parents smiling in front of a tree in a house that legally wasn't settled anymore. The caption read, "Family is everything." I turned my phone face down. At 9:47 p.m., a new message came in. Not the group chat, a private text from Lila. "They're saying you're doing this because you're jealous. Because you don't have what I have." I stared at the words for a long time before replying. "I'm doing this because something was taken from me without my consent." And I finally noticed. She didn't respond. 2 weeks later, the first deposition was scheduled. My father would go first. Marjorie prepped me carefully. "You won't be in the room," she said, "but what he says will shape everything." "What if he lies?" I asked. "He will," she replied calmly. "Most people do. That's why we document." The morning of the deposition, I went to work as usual. I sat through meetings. I answered emails. I nodded at a joke someone made in the break room. At 11:32 a.m., my phone buzzed. A text from Marjorie. He contradicted himself 3 times. I closed my laptop slowly. Outside, the sun was bright. Ordinary. The world hadn't paused for this moment. But inside me, something clicked into place. The truth didn't need me to shout. It just needed time. And for the first time, time was on my side. By the time my mother's deposition was scheduled, the story they'd been telling themselves had already started to crack. Not publicly. Not yet. But inside the small, controlled world where reputation mattered more than truth, the pressure was building. My parents had always been careful people. Church on Sundays, neighborhood barbecues, Christmas cards with handwritten notes. They curated an image of stability so polished that even they seemed to believe it. That image had protected them for decades. Now, it was under oath. I didn't attend the deposition, but I listened to the recording later in Marjorie's office. Her voice was calm. My mother's was not. At first, she sounded confident, warm, almost charming. She talked about how close she'd been to Grandma Ruth in her final years, how often she visited, how involved she'd been with helping manage things. Then the questions shifted. Dates, documents, emails. Her voice changed. Not dramatically, just enough. She couldn't recall who had suggested updating the will. She wasn't sure why the original attorney hadn't been used. She didn't remember exactly when Grandma Ruth had signed the revision, only that it was around that time. Around that time turned into a 2-week window. 2 weeks, when Grandma Ruth's medical records showed advanced confusion, medication changes, and multiple notes about diminished capacity. When Marjorie paused the recording, she didn't look triumphant. She looked thoughtful. "They're not villains," she said. "They're people who convinced themselves they were justified." "That's worse," I replied. It was around then that my family stopped calling and started strategizing. Lila texted less emotionally and more carefully. Short messages, neutral phrasing. "Mom wants to resolve this without court. Dad thinks mediation would be better for everyone." I didn't respond. My father emailed instead. A long message filled with phrases like family legacy and unintended consequences. He suggested we meet privately, just the two of us, to clear the air. Marjorie read it and shook her head. "He wants to regain control of the narrative," she said, "not the relationship." "I'm not meeting him," I replied. "Good." A week later, something interesting happened. The family business my father ran, a small financial consulting firm that catered mostly to retirees, was suddenly very quiet. My aunt mentioned in passing that he'd canceled 2 client lunches. A neighbor texted to ask if everything was okay, because she'd seen a process server outside their house. I hadn't sent one. Marjorie had. As part of discovery, they hadn't expected that. The lawsuit wasn't just freezing the house. It was pulling threads, financial statements, emails, transfers, the kind of paperwork that didn't look dangerous until someone asked the wrong question. I got my first real glimpse of the panic one night when Lila showed up at my apartment again. She looked different this time. No makeup, hair pulled back too tightly. Her confidence was brittle. "You could have talked to me," she said, standing just inside my doorway. "Before you did all this." "I did talk to you," I replied. "You didn't listen." She laughed, sharp and humorless. "You never wanted this house. You moved away. You built your life somewhere else. I didn't want to lose it like this." She crossed her arms. "Mom says Grandma changed her mind because you were distant. That's convenient." "She felt abandoned," Lila snapped. "She thought you didn't care anymore." I met her eyes. "Do you really believe that?" She hesitated, just for a second. Then she said, "It doesn't matter what I believe. The will is legal. So is my challenge." Her shoulders slumped. "You're going to take this all the way, aren't you?" "Yes." She sat down heavily on my couch. "You know what happens if you win, right?" I said nothing. "The house gets tied up for years. Legal fees eat into everything. Even if you get it, it won't feel like a victory." I studied her face, the lines of stress around her eyes, the way she spoke, like someone reciting someone else's talking points. "This was never about winning," I said. "It was about stopping." "Stopping what?" I leaned forward. "Stopping you and Mom and Dad from deciding what I'm allowed to lose." She looked away. "You always make it sound so calculated," she muttered, "like we're villains." "I don't need villains," I replied. "I need boundaries." She stood abruptly. "If this goes public, people will ask questions." "Yes," I said. "They will." She shook her head. "You don't understand. Dad's clients, Mom's friends, the church, everyone will know. That's the point." She stared at me, really stared, like she was finally seeing me as someone unpredictable. "You've changed," she said. "I've stopped absorbing impact," I replied. She left without saying goodbye. The first court hearing was scheduled for mid-February. Just procedural. Motions, deadlines, nothing dramatic. But the night before, my father sent one last message. "If you go through with this, don't expect things to ever be the same." I read it twice. Then I deleted it. Things were already not the same. They just hadn't noticed when the shift happened. At the hearing, I sat quietly behind Marjorie. My parents sat across the aisle, rigid and pale. Lila wasn't there. The judge listened, asked questions, set a trial date. On the way out, my mother tried to catch my eye. I didn't look back. Outside, the courthouse steps were busy with people rushing through their own problems. No one cared about ours. That anonymity felt like freedom. Marjorie turned to me. "You're holding up well." "I'm not holding up," I said. "I'm holding my ground." She smiled slightly. That's usually when the other side starts making mistakes. 2 days later, one of my father's former clients contacted Marjorie. He'd heard about the lawsuit. He had questions. And he wasn't the only one. I didn't know it yet, but the thing my parents feared most wasn't losing the house. It was losing the illusion that had protected them for so long, and that illusion was starting to cost them more than they could afford. The first settlement offer arrived on a Thursday afternoon, slipped into my inbox between a budget review and a meeting request from HR. It was short, polite, almost friendly. They proposed a cash payout in exchange for me withdrawing the challenge to the will. No admission of wrongdoing, no apology, just money, wrapped in language about preserving family harmony. I forwarded it to Marjorie without comment. She called me 10 minutes later. "They're nervous," she said. "This is early." "How nervous?" I asked. "Nervous enough to try to buy silence before discovery really opens." The number itself wasn't small. To someone else, it might have felt generous. To me, it felt insulting. Not because I wanted the house for its market value, but because they still believed everything could be reduced to a transaction if the price was right. "I'm not interested," I said. "Thought so," Marjorie replied. "But their next move won't be as polite." She was right. Within a week, the tone shifted. My father's attorney filed a motion accusing me of acting in bad faith, claiming I was motivated by resentment and greed. The language was sharp, almost personal. They painted me as the distant daughter who resurfaced only when money was involved. I read the filing once, then again more slowly. What struck me wasn't the accusation. It was how familiar it sounded. That narrative had been rehearsed for years, just never written down. She's always been cold. She doesn't need much. She moved away. They were finally saying out loud what they'd implied my entire life. Marjorie wasn't concerned. "They're posturing," she said. "Judges don't care about family mythology. They care about evidence." Still, the filing did what it was meant to do. It escalated. My aunt called for the first time in years, her voice cautious, like she was walking into a room where something had already broken. "I just want to understand what's happening," she said. "Your parents are very upset." "I'm sure they are. They say you're trying to take everything." "I'm trying to restore what was changed." She hesitated. They didn't mention that part. Of course they hadn't. At work, I stayed focused. Too focused, maybe. I volunteered for projects no one wanted. I stayed late. I kept my calendar full so I wouldn't have to think about what was unraveling elsewhere. Then, on a Tuesday morning, Marjorie sent me an email with the subject line, "Financial Disclosures." Inside were summaries of documents my parents had been required to submit. It took me a few minutes to understand what I was reading. Accounts I didn't know existed. Transfers that didn't align with their reported income. A loan taken out against the Maple Ridge house months before Grandma Ruth passed, conveniently paid off after the revised will was filed. I felt something cold settle in my chest. They hadn't just moved the inheritance. They'd leveraged it. Marjorie called again. "This complicates their position, legally and ethically," she said. "If the court believes they benefited financially from the revision beyond the house itself, the scrutiny increases." That afternoon, Lila showed up again. This time, she didn't knock. She buzzed the intercom repeatedly until I answered. When I opened the door, she walked past me without asking, her movements sharp and frantic. "Why didn't you tell me?" she demanded. "Tell you what?" She spun around. "About the loan. About the house being used as collateral." I stared at her. "You didn't know?" Her face crumpled in a way I'd never seen before. Not performative. Not dramatic. Real. "They told me it was paid off years ago," she said. "They said the house was free and clear." I sat down slowly. "You should talk to your attorney." "I don't have an attorney," she snapped. "I trusted them." There it was. The same sentence I could have said 10 years earlier. She paced my living room, hands tangled in her hair. "Trevor and I were planning to refinance, use the equity to renovate the upstairs. The bank flagged it. That's why the contractor stopped, I said quietly. She stopped pacing, looked at me. You knew, she said. I suspected. You let me plan a life around something that wasn't real. I met her eyes. That's what they did to me. She sank onto the couch, suddenly small. They promised me this was secure. They promise what they need to promise, to keep control. She laughed bitterly. You sound like a lawyer. No, I said. I sound like someone who learned the pattern. For the first time, she didn't argue. She didn't defend them. She just sat there, absorbing the idea that the ground beneath her wasn't solid. What happens now? She asked. Now, I said, the truth becomes expensive. The next settlement offer came 3 days later. It was larger, more urgent, included language about confidentiality. Marjorie's response was immediate and firm. No. That's when my father finally called me directly. Not to argue, not to threaten, to plead. I don't understand why you're doing this, he said, his voice strained. We gave you everything we could. I closed my eyes. You gave me responsibility and called it love. That's not fair. No, I replied. It's accurate. There was a long silence. Then, quietly, if this goes to trial, it will destroy us. I thought of Grandma Ruth's letter, of her house, of the way decisions had been made without me in the room. I didn't build this, I said. I just stopped pretending it wasn't there. He hung up. 2 weeks later, one of his clients filed a complaint, then another. Not because of me directly, but because questions had started circulating. About transparency, about trust, about whether the man advising them on their finances had been honest about his own. The illusion was cracking. And for the first time, my parents weren't asking me to come home for Christmas. They were asking how much it would cost to make this go away. They still didn't understand the most important part. This was no longer something money could fix. And the longer they delayed accepting that, the more control they lost. The trial date loomed closer, and with every document uncovered, every quiet conversation turned public record, the balance of power shifted further away from them. I wasn't chasing revenge. I was watching accountability take shape. And it was far more unsettling than anger ever could be. The letter from the bank arrived before the apology ever did. Not to me, to Lila. She forwarded it late one night with no message attached, just the scanned pages and a timestamp that told me she hadn't slept. The subject line read, Notice of Default and Right to Cure. I read it slowly. The Maple Ridge house wasn't just collateral. It was the last thing holding together a stack of decisions my parents had made quietly, confidently, assuming no one would ever look too closely. The loan had been interest only for the first 2 years. The grace period had expired. Payments had been missed. The house everyone was fighting over was already slipping. I didn't feel satisfaction when I realized that. I felt something colder. Recognition. This was never about giving Leela security or honoring Grandma Ruth's wishes. The house wasn't a gift. It was a tool, a buffer, something to lean on while they kept the illusion alive a little longer. Lila called me after midnight. I don't know what to do, she said. Her voice was flat, exhausted. Trevor is furious. Not at you, at them. I leaned against my kitchen counter, listening. They told us the finances were fine, she continued. That the lawsuit was just you being resentful. But now the bank is involved, and Trevor's asking questions I don't know how to answer. You don't have to answer them, I said. They do. She let out a shaky breath. Mom keeps saying this is all your fault. I didn't respond. She says if you just dropped the case, none of this would be happening. That's not true, I said calmly. It was already happening. I just stopped covering for it. Silence stretched between us. I don't know who they are anymore, Lila said finally. I thought about how long it had taken me to say that out loud to myself. That's usually when things start to change, I replied. The next morning, Marjorie called earlier than usual. They're in trouble, she said. More than they're admitting. Financially? And strategically. Their counsel requested a continuance. I frowned. Why? They're unprepared, she said, and they're hoping time will make you tired. I smiled faintly. It won't. That's what worries them. That afternoon, I took a long lunch and drove past Maple Ridge Road for the first time in months. I didn't stop. I didn't park. I just slowed down enough to look. The rose bushes Grandma Ruth loved were gone, ripped out to make room for a modern fence. The porch swing had been replaced with minimalist chairs that looked like they'd never been sat in. The house felt smaller somehow, not because it had changed, but because the meaning had. I realized then that even if I won, even if the court restored the will, the house itself was no longer the point. It wasn't the sanctuary I remembered. That version of it existed only in memory. And strangely, that didn't weaken my resolve. It sharpened it. 2 days later, my mother called from an unfamiliar number. I almost didn't answer. Almost. "Evelyn," she said, her voice tight and controlled. "We need to talk." "I'm at work," I replied. "This can't wait." I stepped into a conference room and closed the door. "What is it?" She inhaled sharply. "The bank is threatening foreclosure." "I know." "You know?" Her voice rose. "How could you possibly know?" "Because this isn't happening in isolation," I said. "It's happening because of choices you made." She laughed bitterly. "You sound just like your lawyer." "I sound like someone who reads documents." There was a pause. Then her tone shifted, softer, familiar. "We were trying to protect the family," she said. "You always think everything is so black and white." "No," I replied. "I think accountability is." She sighed. "If we lose the house, it will destroy your father." "You leveraged it," I said. "You risked it. We didn't think it would come to this." "That's the problem," I said. "You never think it will." Her voice cracked. "What do you want from us?" The question landed heavily. I thought about it carefully before answering. "I want the truth acknowledged," I said. "On record, in court. And then we let the law decide the rest." She was quiet for a long time. "You really are taking this all the way," she said finally. "Yes." The next filing came with a shift in tone. No more accusations of bad faith. No more character attacks. Just a request to discuss alternative resolutions. Marjorie reviewed it and nodded. "They're realizing the house isn't the prize anymore," she said. "It's the liability. And me, you're the variable they can't control." That week, my father's firm quietly announced it was suspending new client intake. No explanation given. Just a brief notice on their website about restructuring. The illusion was thinning. Lila stopped texting, not out of anger, I suspected, but because she was finally seeing the situation clearly. And clarity is uncomfortable when it arrives late. The court scheduled mediation as a last attempt before trial. Marjorie asked me once more if I wanted to consider settlement. "What would settling give me?" I asked. "Certainty," she said. "And what would it cost?" Silence. I shook my head. No. On the eve of mediation, I received a message from Trevor. The first one he'd ever sent me directly. "We need to talk. Not about the house. About what happens after." I stared at the screen. After. It was the first time anyone in my family had acknowledged that this wasn't just a fight, but a turning point. I replied with a single word: tomorrow. That night, I slept better than I had in weeks. Not because things were resolved, but because I finally understood something essential. The house was never the inheritance. The power to decide what I accepted was. And no matter how mediation ended, that part was no longer negotiable. Tomorrow, the story would shift again. And this time, it wouldn't be about property at all. Mediation took place in a low, windowless office building, halfway between my parents' town and mine. Neutral ground, neutral walls, neutral coffee that tasted like cardboard. Nothing else about that day was neutral. Marjorie arrived early with a slim binder and the kind of calm that comes from knowing where the leverage sits. I arrived 5 minutes later, dressed plainly, no armor, no softness, just myself. My parents were already there. My father looked older than I remembered. Not frail, but diminished, like a man who'd been holding his breath for years and was finally running out of air. My mother sat upright beside him, back straight, hands folded, her face carefully arranged into something resembling dignity. Lila sat a few chairs away from them. She didn't look at me when I walked in. The mediator, a retired judge named Alan Myers, greeted everyone and explained the process. Confidential, voluntary, an attempt to avoid trial. "We're not here to decide who's right," he said. "We're here to see if there's a resolution everyone can live with." I thought, not for the first time, how often that sentence had been used in my family, to mean one person swallowing discomfort so others could remain comfortable. We were separated into different rooms. The mediator went back and forth, carrying offers like fragile packages. The first proposal came quickly. My parents would keep the house. I would receive a lump sum payment and a written acknowledgement that Grandma Ruth loved us both. I didn't even look at Marjorie. "No," I said. Alan nodded, unsurprised. "What would you consider acceptable?" I took a breath. An admission that the will was changed under their direction. In writing, filed with the court. His eyebrows lifted slightly. "That's significant." "Yes." He left the room. Minutes passed. Then more. When he returned, his expression had changed. "They're upset," he said carefully. "They feel you're asking them to destroy themselves." I looked at him. "I'm asking them to tell the truth." He studied me for a moment. "Why does that matter so much to you?" The answer came easily. "Because my entire life was built around lies that benefited other people." He nodded slowly and stood. While he was gone, Marjorie leaned toward me. "They didn't expect that," she said quietly. "They expected negotiation. You just reframed the entire room." That was the point. When the mediator returned again, he didn't bring an offer. He brought Trevor. Alan asked if we were comfortable meeting together. I agreed. Trevor sat across from me, his posture stiff, his expression serious in a way I'd never seen at family gatherings. This wasn't the polished, charming man my parents had welcomed so eagerly. This was someone recalculating his entire foundation. "I'll be direct," he said. "This can't continue the way it is." "I agree," I replied. He glanced toward the door, then back at me. "Lila didn't know about the loan, or the refinancing, or the risk." "I know." "And she built her life assuming the house was secure." "I know." He exhaled. "That's on them, not you." That was the first time anyone outside myself had said it that plainly. "What do you want?" he asked. I didn't rush the answer. "I want the will restored to its original form," I said. "And I want the court record to reflect that the revision was directed by my parents, not my grandmother." "And the house?" "I don't intend to live there." He frowned. "Then why fight so hard?" "Because if I don't," I said evenly, "this becomes the story they tell forever. That I was difficult, that I was greedy, that they were victims of my resentment." He nodded once. "If the will is restored, the house becomes part of the estate again." "Yes." "And subject to the bank's claim." "Yes." Silence stretched. "You realize that means it may be sold," he said, "to cover the debt." "I do. And no one ends up with it." I met his gaze. "That's still more honest than how it was taken." He leaned back, considering that. "I'm not your enemy," he said finally. "I know," I replied. "But I'm not your solution either." He stood to leave. At the door, he paused. "For what it's worth," he said, "I respect how you're handling this." After he left, the mediator returned, alone. "They're willing to consider your terms," he said, "but there's something else." I waited. "They want you to agree to attend a family meeting afterward, to discuss moving forward." I almost laughed. "No," I said, "that's not part of mediation." He nodded. "I thought you might say that." The final offer came late in the afternoon. They would sign a sworn statement acknowledging their role in initiating the will change. The original will would be submitted for reinstatement. The house would return to the estate, subject to outstanding debts. No confidentiality clause. No family statement. Just facts. Marjorie looked at me. "This is solid." I closed my eyes for a moment. This was the moment they had feared. Not losing the house, but losing control of the narrative. "I accept," I said. The agreement was drafted quickly, signed quietly. No tears, no apologies, just signatures. When it was done, my father asked if he could speak to me alone. Marjorie stayed close, but didn't intervene. "I never thought you'd go this far," he said, his voice low. "I never thought I'd need to," I replied. "You've changed," he said again, like an accusation. "No," I said gently. "I stopped compensating." He nodded, as if that hurt more than anger would have. As I walked out of the building, the late afternoon sun hit my face, warm and steady. The house was no longer anyone's prize. The story had shifted, and for the first time, the truth was on paper, not buried in family tradition or selective memory. But the consequences were only just beginning. Because once a lie collapses publicly, it doesn't fall quietly. And next, the fallout would reach far beyond Maple Ridge Road. The agreement was filed the following Monday. No press release, no announcement, just a stamped document entering public record. Quiet and irreversible. By Wednesday, People had started asking questions. It began the way these things always do. Indirectly, casually. A neighbor just checking in. A former client emailing my father about a rumor he'd heard at church. An old family friend calling my mother to ask if everything was all right because someone mentioned a court case involving Grandma Ruth's estate. The truth had left the mediation room. And once it did, it stopped belonging to anyone. My parents underestimated that part. They'd believed admitting to directing the will change would be contained within legal boundaries, that no one outside the process would connect the dots. They forgot something important. In families like ours, reputation is currency. And when that currency suddenly fluctuates, everyone notices. My aunt called me again, this time without pretense. "So it's true," she said. "Your parents pushed your grandmother to change the will." "Yes." There was a long pause. I wondered. "Ruth never stopped talking about you." I said nothing. "They told everyone she changed her mind because you weren't around," my aunt continued. "But now people are saying she was confused near the end." "Medical records support that," I replied. She exhaled slowly. "Your mother is furious. Not about the house, about what people are saying." I almost smiled. Within a week, my father's firm lost 3 more clients. Not dramatically, not angrily, just quietly. Emails about reassessing priorities. Phone calls not returned. Lunch meetings postponed indefinitely. Trust, once cracked, doesn't shatter all at once. It erodes. Trevor called me that Friday evening. "We're putting the house on the market," he said. I leaned back on my couch, staring at the ceiling. "The bank pushed for it," he continued. "They don't want to risk foreclosure proceedings dragging on." "That makes sense." "Lila's taking it hard," he admitted. "She feels like everything she built there was temporary." I thought about the fence, the new patio, the rose bushes ripped out. "Some things were always temporary," I said gently. He sighed. "My parents warned me about marrying into unresolved family dynamics." "And?" I thought I was smarter than that. I smiled faintly. Most of us do. The house sold quickly, below what my parents had once bragged it was worth. Enough to cover the loan and legal fees, but not enough to save them from the consequences of years of financial shortcuts. When the proceeds were distributed, there was nothing left to argue over. No inheritance, no victory, just a closed chapter. My parents downsized within a month, sold their larger home, moved into a modest rental closer to my father's office, which was now operating at half capacity. My mother stopped calling. Not dramatically, not angrily, she simply went quiet. That silence felt different than the ones before. Less strategic, more hollow. Lila reached out instead. "Do you want to get coffee?" she asked one afternoon. Just us. We met at a small place halfway between our cities. She arrived early, already seated, stirring a drink she hadn't touched. "I don't know how to talk to them anymore," she said as soon as I sat down. "You don't have to," I replied. "They keep acting like this was all done to them," she said. "Like they're the victims." "That's how they survive it," I said. She looked at me carefully. "How did you survive it?" I thought about that. "I stopped trying to be understood," I said, and started insisting on being respected. She nodded slowly. "I don't think I've ever done that. It takes practice." She hesitated. "Do you hate me?" "No." "Why not?" "Because you were raised inside the same system," I said. "You just benefited from it longer." Tears filled her eyes, but she didn't cry. "I'm trying to figure out who I am without all of this," she admitted. "So am I said, just from a different starting point." After that, things settled. Not neatly, not happily, but truth has a way of exhausting drama. At work, I was promoted quietly. More responsibility, less visibility. Exactly the kind of recognition I preferred. I moved departments. Not because I needed to, but because I wanted a place untouched by that chapter of my life. One evening, months later, I received a message from my father. "I don't expect forgiveness, but I wanted you to know I understand now why you did what you did. I should have protected you. I didn't." I read it once. Then I set my phone down. Understanding didn't erase damage, but it did something else. It ended the chase. I never replied. Not out of cruelty, out of completion. The story they'd written for me had finally run out of pages. And for the first time, the quiet that followed wasn't empty. It was mine. But the real shift didn't come from the house selling or the money disappearing. It came from realizing something far more unsettling. Without control, without leverage, without the narrative they'd relied on for decades, they had nothing left to offer me, and I was finally free enough not to need anything from them. That freedom, I would learn, came with its own consequences and its own responsibility. Because once you reclaim your place in the story, you can't pretend not to see the patterns anymore. Not in family, not in work, not anywhere. And that awareness was about to change one more thing I hadn't yet considered: my sense of loyalty and who it truly belonged to. Loyalty had always been my default setting, not because anyone taught it to me explicitly, but because it was rewarded in subtle ways. A nod of approval, less tension in the room, the unspoken relief that I wasn't difficult. After the house sold and the legal dust settled, I expected things to feel lighter immediately. Instead, there was a strange lag, like stepping off a moving walkway and needing a moment for your balance to catch up. Nothing was actively wrong, and yet something felt exposed. It took me a while to understand why. I had spent my entire life orienting myself around other people's expectations, my parents' needs, Lila's orbit, even Grandma Ruth's quiet hopes. Loyalty had given my choices structure, even when that structure was suffocating. Now that it was gone, I had to decide where it belonged next. The question came into focus at work. 3 months after mediation, my company announced a restructuring. Nothing dramatic, no layoffs, just a shift in leadership roles as we expanded into a new market. My manager, Daniel, called me into his office late one afternoon. "You've been doing excellent work," he said. "Consistent, reliable." There was that word again. "We're considering you for a senior role on the new operations team," he continued. "It's more responsibility, longer hours, less visibility." I waited. "It would mean stepping back from some of the strategic initiatives you've been pushing for," he added. "But the team needs stability right now." Stability. I'd built my career on being that person, the one who absorbed pressure so others could move freely, the one who stayed late without being asked. A year ago, I would have said yes without hesitation. "Can I think about it?" I asked. Daniel looked surprised. "Of course." That night, I went for a long walk through my neighborhood. The air was cool, the streets quiet. I replayed the conversation in my head, not looking for what he'd said, but what he hadn't. The role wasn't a promotion. It was containment. They wanted my loyalty, not my growth. The realization didn't make me angry. It made me tired. I emailed Daniel the next morning. "Thank you for considering me. After some thought, I don't believe this role aligns with where I want to go next. I'd like to continue focusing on strategic development." His reply was polite, professional, distant. "Understood. We'll revisit later." Later, I learned, often means never, and I was okay with that. That same week, Lila called. "I'm thinking about moving," she said. "Not far. Just somewhere that doesn't feel like a reminder." That makes sense. "I keep realizing how much of my life was curated," she said carefully. "By them." I pictured our childhood living room, the way conversations were steered, the topics that were encouraged, the ones that quietly disappeared. "It's unsettling," she continued, "to realize your loyalty was rented." I smiled faintly. "That's one way to put it." "Did you always know?" she asked. "No," I said. "I just felt it earlier." We sat in silence for a moment. "I don't know how to be a sister to you," she admitted, "without all of that in between." "Then don't be," I replied. "Just be a person." She laughed softly. "You make it sound easy." "It's not," I said. "It's just simpler." After we hung up, I thought about how different our conversation felt from any we'd had before. No roles, no expectations, no emotional debt, just honesty. It occurred to me then that loyalty without reciprocity isn't loyalty at all. It's maintenance. The final test came unexpectedly. My mother showed up at my new apartment one Saturday morning. No warning, no text. I opened the door and saw her standing there, smaller than I remembered. Her coat, too thin for the weather. "I was in the area," she said. I didn't invite her in immediately. "Can we talk?" she asked. I stepped aside. She walked through my living room slowly, taking everything in. The clean lines, the absence of family photos, the neutral calm of a space that belonged to no one but me. "You've done well," she said quietly. Sit, I replied. She did. For a moment, neither of us spoke. I don't recognize you anymore, she said finally. I met her gaze. You never really did. Her lips pressed together. That's not fair. No, I said gently. It's just uncomfortable. She took a breath. I lost friends over this. I waited. People look at me differently, she continued. They ask questions. They don't invite me the way they used to. I nodded. That's what happens when stories change. She leaned forward. Was it worth it? The question was sharp, honest. I didn't answer immediately. Yes, I said finally, but not for the reasons you think. She frowned. Then why? Because I don't wake up bracing anymore, I said. I don't calculate my words. I don't pre-apologize for existing. Her eyes filled, but she didn't cry. I did what I thought was best, she whispered. I know, I replied. That's the problem. She sat back, defeated. I don't know how to fix this, she said. You don't, I replied. You adjust to it. She looked at me like that was worse. When she left, I didn't feel relief. I felt clarity. Loyalty, I realized, wasn't something you owed because of history. It was something you chose because of behavior. And once that distinction settles in, it changes everything. The way you show up, the way you listen, the way you decide who gets access to you. That night, I wrote something down for the first time since this all began. Not for court, not for proof, for myself. I am not disloyal for choosing myself. I was loyal for too long to people who mistook access for entitlement. The next chapter of my life wouldn't be shaped by who needed me to stay small. It would be shaped by who respected me when I didn't. And that decision, quiet as it was, would lead to the final turning point I hadn't yet seen coming. Because once you withdraw loyalty from the wrong places, you start noticing where it's actually earned. And that realization was about to test me one last time. The email arrived on a Monday morning, flagged as urgent, sent directly to my personal account. Subject: Estate clarification. Immediate attention requested. I knew who it was from before I opened it. My mother's handwriting had always been careful, deliberate. Her emails were the same. Long sentences, soft language, a tone that suggested concern while quietly assigning responsibility. Evelyn, we've been advised that there may be unresolved matters related to your grandmother's personal effects. Certain items were not accounted for in the estate distribution, and it would mean a great deal to your father and me if you could help clarify what was intended. We're hoping to resolve this privately, without further legal involvement. Please let me know when you're available. I stared at the screen, the familiar tightening in my chest rising out of habit more than emotion. They were trying, again. Not for the house, not for money, for access. I forwarded the email to Marjorie with a single line. Is there anything legally required of me here? Her response came within the hour. Number: the estate is closed. Anything further would be voluntary. Voluntary. That word used to trap me. It had been the justification for every extra mile I walked alone, every boundary I blurred, every quiet sacrifice that no one acknowledged because it was never technically required. I closed my laptop and sat back. The temptation wasn't to help them. It was to explain, to soften the refusal, to make it understandable, to protect them from discomfort one last time. That was the reflex I'd spent a lifetime building, and that was the line I finally saw clearly. I replied to my mother with 3 sentences. I'm not involved in any further matters related to the estate. There's nothing I need to clarify. Please direct future questions through legal counsel. I didn't add warmth. I didn't add blame. I didn't add an explanation. The silence that followed was immediate and loud. 2 days passed, then 3. On the 4th day, my father called. I let it ring. He left a voicemail. His voice was strained, tired, unfamiliar. I don't understand why you're doing this, he said. We're just asking for help. Help. That word used to mean something different to me. I didn't return the call. Instead, something unexpected happened. Daniel from work asked to see me. I assumed it was about the restructuring, maybe a follow-up to the role I'd declined. I walked into his office, prepared for professional disappointment. What I wasn't prepared for was the look on his face. We may have misjudged you, he said. I raised an eyebrow. The expansion didn't go the way we hoped, he continued. We moved fast, too fast. The team needs someone who can think structurally, not just keep things running. I waited. We want to revisit your strategic proposal, he said. The one we passed on. I felt a small, quiet shift inside me. And? I asked. And if you're still interested, he said, we'd like you to lead it. This wasn't a reward. It was recognition. The kind that arrives only after you stop offering yourself as support and start standing as substance. I'll need autonomy, I said. An authority that matches responsibility. He nodded. That's reasonable. For the first time, I believed him. When I left his office, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt aligned. That evening, Lila called. I heard Mom tried to loop you back in, she said. Yes, I told her not to, Lila added quietly. I paused. You did? She keeps saying you've changed, Lila said. And I finally realized that's what she's actually afraid of. I smiled softly. Change removes leverage. She asked me to convince you, Lila continued. I told her I wouldn't. That mattered more than I expected. Thank you, I said. She hesitated. I'm learning what it means to stop negotiating my boundaries. It's uncomfortable, I said. It is, she agreed. But it's also clarifying. After we hung up, I thought about how strange it was that the final test of my loyalty didn't come during court hearings or mediation rooms. It came afterward, when everything was supposedly over, when there was no legal reason to stay guarded. That's when old patterns try to sneak back in, disguised as reconciliation, as reasonableness, as family. And that's when boundaries matter most. A week later, a small envelope arrived in the mail, no return address. Inside was Grandma Ruth's watch, the one I'd already received years ago, along with a note in my mother's handwriting. We found this among your grandmother's things. I thought you should have it. I held the watch in my palm for a long time. It wasn't guilt, I felt. It was closure. They were still trying to give me fragments instead of accountability, and I no longer needed either. I placed the watch in my drawer, closed it, and didn't look back. That night, I updated my calendar. New project start date, new priorities, no family obligations marked in advance. The line had been drawn in the quietest way possible. No argument, no confrontation. Just a refusal to re-enter a role I'd outgrown. And that refusal would echo farther than any courtroom victory ever could. Because when you stop explaining your boundaries, the people who relied on your silence feel it most. And next, the consequences of that silence breaking would reach the one place my parents had always assumed was untouchable, their version of the future. And they were about to learn they no longer had a say in mine. The invitation came in the mail, not by text or email, which told me everything I needed to know. Heavy cardstock, cream-colored. My parents' return address in the corner, the handwriting deliberate, formal, like they were sending something ceremonial instead of personal. Inside was an announcement. A joint birthday dinner, 55 years of marriage, a small gathering of close friends and family at a private restaurant near their new apartment, a celebration of resilience, gratitude, and new beginnings. The words were carefully chosen, sanitized, as if the past year had been a minor inconvenience instead of a structural collapse. At the bottom, in my mother's handwriting, we would really like you there. It would mean a lot. I set the invitation down on my kitchen table and stared at it longer than I should have. This was the future they'd always assumed would exist by default. Milestones, gatherings, the expectation that time itself would soften everything, that distance would eventually turn into nostalgia, and nostalgia into compliance. They hadn't invited me because they understood me. They invited me because they believed enough time had passed. I didn't respond. 2 days later, my father emailed. Not accusatory, not pleading, measured. We're trying to move forward. I hope you'll consider meeting us halfway. Halfway. I almost smiled. That phrase had defined my childhood. I'd spent decades walking the full distance while being told we were meeting in the middle. I didn't reply to the email either. Instead, something else demanded my attention. The board presentation. The project Daniel had put back in my hands wasn't small. It was a structural redesign of how our division handled long-term planning, risk management, and resource allocation. The kind of work that changed who had influence and who didn't. I spent nights refining it, not out of fear, but out of ownership. When the day came, I stood at the head of a long table, faces turned toward me, waiting. I spoke clearly, calmly. I didn't rush. I didn't soften the difficult parts. I watched people lean in when I spoke about sustainability, about choosing long-term integrity over short-term comfort, about how systems fail not because of one bad decision, but because of 1,000 unchallenged assumptions. When I finished, the room was quiet. Then someone said, "Why haven't we been doing it this way already?" Daniel didn't look at me. He looked impressed. 2 hours later, the proposal passed unanimously. I walked out of that building feeling something I hadn't allowed myself to feel in a long time. Pride. Not the fragile kind that needs validation. The grounded kind that comes from alignment. That evening, Lila called. "They're not taking it well," she said. I assumed. "Mom's telling people you're busy with work and that you'll come around," she continued. "She's framing it like distance, not refusal." Of course she is. "She asked if you'd at least come to the dinner for appearances." I closed my eyes. "No," I said. "I'm not negotiating attendance anymore." Lila exhaled. I told her that. "Thank you. She doesn't understand how final you sound." "She doesn't need to," I replied. "She just needs to hear it." There was a pause. "I'm proud of you," Lila said quietly. It caught me off guard. "For what?" "For not folding," she said. "For not turning this into another quiet compromise." I swallowed. That night, I RSVP'd. Not yes, not no. I didn't respond at all. On the night of the dinner, I cooked for myself. Simple food, good wine, no background noise. I imagined them at the restaurant. The empty chair, the questions, the polite deflections. For the first time, my absence wasn't something to be explained away by me. They would have to sit with it. A week later, my father sent one final message. "I see now that you've chosen a different path. I hope it brings you peace." I read it once. Then I archived it. Not because it hurt, because it no longer had anywhere to land. The future, they assumed, would wait for reconciliation, for my return, for my eventual softening. That future belonged to someone else now. I had stepped into my own. And there was one last thing left to do. Not for them, for myself. To close the story cleanly. Not with confrontation, but with intention. Because the most complete form of revenge isn't punishment. It's living so fully outside the old narrative that it can no longer reach you. And that realization would shape how this story truly ended. The last thing I did was small. No court filing. No announcement, no final conversation. I changed my emergency contact. I stood in my kitchen one quiet Sunday morning, coffee cooling on the counter, phone in my hand. The screen showed the familiar name that had been there for years, my mother's. I stared at it longer than I expected, not because I doubted the decision, because of how ordinary it felt. I replaced her name with Lila's. Then I closed the app. That was it. No dramatic break. No speech about boundaries, just a practical choice that reflected the life I was actually living, not the one people assumed I'd return to. A week later, I mailed a single envelope. Inside were copies of the mediation agreement, the restored will, and one short note written in my own handwriting. "Everything is settled. Please don't contact me about the past again. If we speak in the future, let it be about who we are now, not who you needed me to be." I didn't sign it with love. I didn't sign it with anger. I signed my name. That was the last message I sent my parents. Life didn't suddenly become perfect after that. It became quieter, clearer, more honest. At work, my role expanded faster than I expected. People started coming to me, not because I was reliable, but because I was decisive. I learned the difference between being needed and being respected. One drains you, the other sustains you. Lila and I settled into something real. Not close in the sentimental sense, close in the truthful one. We talked when we had something to say. We didn't perform sisterhood. We practiced it. Sometimes she would mention our parents in passing. Updates, neutral facts. I listened without absorbing responsibility. That, too, was new. Months later, I drove past Maple Ridge Road again. The house looked different now. New owners, new paint, a different fence. The porch swing was gone completely. For the first time, I didn't feel grief. I felt distance. And distance, I learned, isn't the absence of love. It's the absence of control. What surprised me most wasn't that my parents lost the house, the business, the image they'd protected for decades. It was that once those things were gone, There was nothing left they could use to reach me. No inheritance, no obligation, no leverage disguised as love. That's what people rarely talk about when they talk about revenge. Real revenge isn't loud. It doesn't look like confrontation or humiliation or triumph. It looks like this: not answering, not explaining, not returning to the table where you were always expected to be grateful for scraps. It looks like choosing yourself so consistently that the old story stops making sense. I didn't win the house. I won something harder. The right to decide who has access to me. The right to walk away without being followed by guilt. The right to build a future that doesn't require anyone's permission. If you're listening to this and something feels familiar, if you've ever been the easy one, the responsible one, the one expected to understand while others are allowed to take, hear this clearly. Being excluded doesn't mean you are unwanted. It often means you are uncontrollable. And choosing yourself isn't betrayal. It's recovery. If this story resonated with you, take a moment to like the video, leave a comment, or subscribe to the channel. These stories exist because people recognize themselves in them. And sometimes, hearing one quiet, honest ending is exactly what we need to start writing our own.